Well, hey everybody, it's the first day of a new month. It's amazing how quickly time flies, isn't it? Today in our Bible reading plan, we're starting the book of 2 Timothy. So open your Bible to the first chapter of 2 Timothy. And what I want to talk about from this passage, there's a phrase that really jumped off the page at me and spoke to my heart, and it's about a godly heritage, but it's not the passage you're probably thinking. It's verse where Paul talked about forefathers in verse 3. But he does mention, and this is the famous passage in verses 5 and following about Timothy's godly heritage, where Paul says to Timothy, this young preacher, I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I'm sure that is in you as well. So Timothy had a godly heritage. But Paul very briefly alludes to his own godly heritage, and that's what caught my attention up there in verse 3. In verse 3, when he says, I thank God, whom I serve with a clear conscience in the way my forefathers did. God, who I serve with a clear conscience, the way my forefathers did. So Paul is talking about his heritage. Now, when he says his forefathers, who's he referring to? Well, some would say he's referring to the great men of Jewish history, of Israel's history, and there's probably some truth in that. But I think he was also referring to his more immediate ancestors. And we're not told a lot about them, but Paul gives us some clues into his family heritage and how godly it really was. And a few pages before Timothy is the book of Philippians, and in chapter 3, starting at verse 4, Paul says, although I myself have confidence even in the flesh, if anyone else has a mind to put confidence in the flesh, I far more. Circumcised the 8th day. So his parents were faithful Jews who had him circumcised according to Jewish custom on the 8th day. Of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee. While he points to his zealous service in Judaism as an adult, he also alludes to the fact that he came from a very orthodox, a very faithful Jewish family that had him circumcised and raised him the right way. He also alludes to it in the book of Acts. If you'll turn real quickly to Acts chapter 26, Acts chapter 26, Paul is speaking, defending himself before King Agrippa. And in verse 4, he says, so then, all Jews know my manner of life. They know my story, okay? They know my history, my testimony. But notice what he says. They know my manner of life from my youth up. Not just when I was a Pharisee, not just when I was persecuting the church on behalf of Judaism, not just when I was an adult, but they know my story from my youth up, from which from the beginning was spent among my own nation at Jerusalem. So at a young age, Paul's family put him under great Jewish teachers. So the picture that emerges is that Paul's forefathers, yes, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the great men of God in Jewish history, but also his own family were very devout Jews. So in this chapter, we have this picture of godly heritage. Paul had a godly heritage. Timothy had a godly heritage. What about me and you? Some of us do, some of us don't. I did not receive a godly heritage. I didn't have a heritage of faith and love for Jesus passed down to me from my ancestors. I do hope I'm starting one that I pass on to those who come after me. If you came from a family that loved Jesus, not just went to church, but your ancestors, your forefathers were godly and they loved Jesus. They had a genuine, intimate walk with Jesus and they passed that on down to you. Be thankful for that. Don't begrudge it. I see so many young people who begrudge coming from a godly family. That is a great gift of God. Be thankful for it. And you pass it on. Be intentional about discipling your children. Be intentional about being an authentic follower of Jesus, that you can show your kids what that looks like and how they can have that same kind of relationship. You need to understand that a godly heritage is always one generation away from extinction. Godly heritage is always just one generation away from extinction. So be intentional about passing it on. Now maybe you're like me. Your forefathers weren't people who loved Jesus. You did not receive, it was not passed on to you, a godly heritage. You be the ancestor, you be the forefather that down the road, generations into the future, when they talk about, my forefathers, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, when they look back and talk about a godly heritage which they received, you be the one they're talking about. You be just like Paul had his forefathers, you be the forefathers for those who will come after you. And that is one of the greatest gifts you can give your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I want to say that is a greater gift than anything you would leave them in your will or your estate plan. So what did you spiritually receive, and are you thankful for it if it was godly? And what are you passing on? And just how godly and dedicated to Jesus Christ is it? God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.